Tēnā tātou katoa. Ko te mea tuatahi mi ana kia koutou, ko tai mai nei tēnei pō. Nō reira, nau mai haramai. Nau mai haramai ki tēnei o tātou wharetaonga tāmaki, ara ka tamaki painga hira. Welcome to Auckland Museum, the House of Treasures. Nau mai haramai ngā rangatira kei wangini a koutou. Sudan, ngā mema o te puari, kia koutou rau rangatira ma tēnā koutou katoa. Sudan, members of the board, distinguished guests, welcome to Auckland Museum. Ko te mea tuatahi e mihi ana ki tātou atua, nāna nei te tīmatanga, nāna nei te whakotinga mea katoa. Tuarua ko papatua nuku e horohia ko rangi nui atu nei. Kei wainga ko te pātaka kōrero e mihi kawana kia koutou, kia koe, tēnā tātou katoa. And we acknowledge our Creator, Mother Earth, Sky Father, and this wonderful house of knowledge in between. And we acknowledge all those who have gathered this evening. Tēnā tātou katoa. He mihi kawana ki ngā taonga I roto I tēnei ruma. Tuatahi e mihi ana ki tupuna Hotunui. We acknowledge our ancestor Hotunui behind us. Kia kōrua rei, ko pua haere, ko te ware. We acknowledge our Waikato and Ngāti Pawa ancestor on either side of the stage. Kia koutou rā o te aroa, ko te pua wai o te aroa. He mihi kawana kia koe te toki a tāpuri, me ngā taonga e matakatiki mai tēnei pō. And we also acknowledge all those treasures that look on us this evening. Nō reira, ka hati ngā kōrero, this is not a long speech. He mihi kawana kia koutou, nau mai haramai, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Greetings and have a good evening.
Well, thank you very much, Antoine, and let me also welcome you all here this evening. My name's Don MacKinnon, short-term director of the Auckland War Memorial Museum. I welcome you particularly because you have been invited here, and we're glad that you came to participate in this discussion, conversation about the Auckland War Memorial Museum, our museum. Well, we're very lucky that we have four very eminent people here tonight to help participate in this debate. Dr. Claudia Orange, and of course then three gentlemen, Bob Harvey, Ken Corby and Hamish Keith, sometimes known as three curmudgeons, but tonight we will say they're three very eminent gentlemen. Let me tell you a little bit about the background, because the history of this meeting tonight started a couple of years ago when it was decided to get involved in how the museum should be looking and presenting itself over the next 20 years or so. Now, of course, that's something you just don't do overnight. So in that time, and certainly since I came here, there's been a lot of conversations, meetings, seminars with different groups of people to get a little bit of an idea of what people are expecting. And of course, all of this information has been distilled down to a point where, from the staff point of view, myself and my senior staff have developed a sort of a series of stories that we want to tell you about tonight. The storyteller is one David Hipple, and he's the one who's been telling the story and showing the various options that we are looking at to many groups of staff members, to groups that are interested in the museum through the Institute, the Circle, the Tangata Whenua, our Taumatua group, the Return Services Association, as you know, because of the War Memorial factor, and many others. So he is going to come on the stage very soon and convey to you the sort of things that we're looking at. And frankly, I think there are about 7 or 8 options he is showing you, and that's about the range that we believe that Auckland is generally looking at in the future. Please don't condemn David when he starts to speak simply because you will say, what's this Englishman doing here telling us Kiwis how to run a museum? Well, look, I can tell you about David. He's had a lot of experience over a lot of museums, and the nearly 2 years that he's been here, he's become a very committed Kiwi. He and his family. He even supported the All Blacks over the weekend. So That is saying something. So we want to give you a chance to have a look at what he has got to say, and then, of course, we will have a little shuffle round, then we will bring up our four eminent guests here onto the stage. They will get that discussion going. They will invite contributions from yourself, and we'll just see where that takes us. We are not looking for a conclusion tonight or what exactly we're going forward. This is but one of many meetings that we seek to listen to people from Auckland about our museum. So please welcome David Hipplethwaite to the floor.
Thank you, Sidon, and good evening, everybody. There's a couple of things I want to say about the presentation before I start the presentation. The first of those is what I'm going to share with you tonight is virtually identical to the presentation that has been shared with the rest of the museum community that Sidon has referred to, from the staff to volunteers, the Taumata, Circle, Institute, RSA. The only difference between this presentation and that one is that we've added a little bit of context because there's a certain assumed knowledge I can make when we're presenting to those groups. So you're actually going to get a little bit more than those groups got. The second thing to say about it is when we're talking about our museum, we're really trying to talk about it in a way that encourages discussion and rather than provide all of the answers, which means that we've tried very hard to be as neutral as possible in preparing this. But inevitably, there are quite a lot of subjectivities that come out in the presentation. So if there are subjectivities that you feel are being imposed upon you as somebody else's opinion, I invite you to see past those and put that into the discussion. That's the nature of being human, I'm afraid. Inevitably, there are some subjectivities in here. So those are the only two things to say. I'll launch into it. It takes me about 35 minutes to go through, and then the discussion can carry after that. So the first thing to do is to reiterate the invitation that was sent out and that you have all responded to by coming here. And that is, Auckland Museum is seeking your input to help guide its gallery renewal plan. This is one of the most ambitious projects ever undertaken by the museum, as it sets the framework for the type of galleries the museum will house, ultimately determining the stories it tells and the objects it displays. Just worth restating, that's what we're all here to do. This is the structure of how we're going to go about it. We're going to talk a little bit about why we're doing this. We're going to look briefly at a few other museums and at studies. We're going to look at what Auckland Museum has to be about. Then we're going to think a little bit about our audiences, and finally we'll get to some models that we think can be applied and we should be debating. So let's start with the question, well, why do we renew galleries? And just with a few photographs and sitting in here in Maori Court, acknowledge some of the extraordinary riches that are here and that are around us, that we all know and love, and why we are part of this museum in the first place. And the collection here is an embarrassment of riches. Worth noting that approximately 3% of our collection is on display. That's about average for most museums of our size and scale. So we go back to the question, why do we renew galleries in that case? Well, I put to you that there's 8 reasons why you would ever renew galleries. The first of those is that the content might be out of date. And content goes out of date for a number of reasons, partly because of changes to our collections. For example, loans getting returned to another institution, or donors providing new things to the museum, partly because of changed attitudes. In the past, human remains have often been displayed in museums. That's no longer acceptable. And partly because of new knowledge will also put content out of date. Second reason to renew galleries is the physical condition of the displays is no longer acceptable. And this particularly comes true when we have sensitive objects, the objects sensitive to light, and eventually we have to take them off display. The third reason is that the audience engagement might not be effective. We've got wonderful story to tell with wonderful object, and we look at it and we think, well, people aren't really engaging with this. We've got to do something about that. The fourth reason is that our target audience might not be met and served by that display. And we'll talk a little bit more about target audiences later on in the presentation. Number 5 is that the expectations of the visitors change. From my experience of 15 years working with museums, expectations from visitors change all the time, and they only ever go up. And we have to keep raising our game to always meet that rising expectation of visitors. Number 6 is our visitors deserve change. Many of you will come to this museum many, many times, are frequent visitors, and if it was the same every time, eventually you'd stop coming. Well, everybody deserves change, and Aucklanders deserve change in their museum too. Design can become outdated. Design isn't always timeless, and sometimes things begin to look a little bit dated, and therefore we may need to renew them. And the final reason, number 8, is that there may well be new stories to tell, stories that we haven't told. And that doesn't mean new stories that happened yesterday. It could be new stories that happened 10 and 15 years ago that we haven't told. Now, the reason to list all of these reasons out is if we walk around this museum, we will find, in part, evidence of all of these reasons somewhere around this museum. And we don't need to debate whether it's more of one or another. The fact is that over time, these reasons start to begin to matter, and we need to start to think about renewals. So that's why we renew galleries. The next question is, why do we need a gallery renewal plan? And I would say that it's because keeping Auckland Museum world class is more like this, doing a jigsaw puzzle, than like this, a game of darts. Inevitably, all museums go through many years of this. And what I mean by that is a gallery will be outdated and they need to change it. An object will be returned to its owner or its lender. Other parts will get closed down because they've met their natural end of their life. And over time, as you renew little bits here and there, the whole museum begins to lose coherence because it's been changed by one intervention, another intervention, and another intervention. And periodically, every generation or so, you have to go back and start treating it like a jigsaw puzzle again, which means let's get the picture right. What picture are we trying to create? Let's get all the pieces the right way up. Let's put the frame together and then start to put the pieces together. And so this is why we need a gallery renewal plan, because it takes a lot of planning to treat a museum like a jigsaw puzzle rather than like a dartboard. So all of this discussion is to get us to a project of gallery renewals and other projects around the museum. To do that, as I've just said, what we need to do is have a gallery renewal plan, joined up thinking, or a master plan. To do that, we need to gather quite a lot of information. That's not just information about the content of the museum, although that's something that I know we will all want to discuss. It's also about looking into the future to imagine what role the museum will play. And I'll tell you one example of that. This museum is an educator. We are, as part of our remit, an educator. If we're thinking about a gallery renewal plan for the future, we need to think, well, what role will education in a museum take, not in a year's time or 2 years' time, but in 10 years' time and 15 years' time? So asking this audience, what will your children and grandchildren want to do and engage when they come, either as classes or as young people, to the museum? And so that's part of that information gathering, is looking into the future to see the entire role of a museum, not only the content. But to gather that information, we need to be clear about what vision it is we're trying to create and who are we trying to create it for, what audience we have. So tonight's conversation is here, but this is where we're trying to get to. And I think it's really useful for everyone to see that this is part of a series of steps that are required in such a complex organism as a museum to get right. So as we begin that journey, I'm going to ask some questions to prompt us, which starts with, are we a social and cultural history museum? Or are we a natural sciences museum? Are we a war museum? Or are we a general museum, whatever that is? Are we a museum about Auckland? Are we a museum about New Zealand? Are we a museum about the Pacific? Etc., etc., etc. I have been told in my 2 years here many times, definitively, we are one or other of these things at various times. And it's very hard to be all of these things at the same time. So if we are many things, are we at present the Auckland War Memorial, plus the Pacific People's Museum, plus the New Zealand Maori Museum, plus the north of the North Island Natural History Museum, plus the Auckland Applied Arts Museum, plus the New Zealand War Museum? Again, I've been told definitively, oh no, this is what we are, this is what we are, this is what we are. And you can see that if we are all of those things added together, well, it creates a little bit of confusion. In fact, it creates fog. And this is the beginning of an analogy that I'm going to really stretch for a minute, and please bear with me, the analogy does hold up. But I would say that because we are many things at the same time at the moment, it's very, very difficult for us as a museum community to articulate exactly what it is we're doing, exactly what we're about, and exactly how we can improve that every day. And I describe this as being a bit like in the fog. So the analogy obviously goes, well, how do you get out of the fog? What you need is a nice big beacon, a great big shining light that everyone in the fog can see and start to aim towards. And in our case, the analogy for that light is the vision of what is Auckland Museum all about in, say, 2020, some date in the future. But there's a second part to the analogy, which is the conch shell of who is Auckland Museum for in, say, 2020. And I believe that with these two beacons, the light of a vision and the conch shell of an audience, if we can all see and hear those, then we can paddle our various waka towards it. And this is where I'm stretching the analogy further. But if we imagine all parts of the museum community as being in various waka, from the education team to the exhibitions team to the commercial team to the institute to the board to the circle to the volunteers, they all have such an important part to play in the museum. But if we're all sitting in different waka in the fog, we could all be paddling in a different direction. And so I believe that with the vision of what are we about and the conch shell of who are we for, what are we about, who are we for, what are we about, who are we for, that over time we can begin to steer our various waka on a converging course. We're not attempting to leap in one single bound from being in a complex position of a difficult museum to articulate in the fog to being suddenly all sorted in one leap. That's unrealistic and not really desirable, but we are trying to set ourselves on a course where gradually, over the coming years, we can be clearer and clearer and more joined up in all of that thinking. And so this begs the question, well, what is that vision and what is that audience strategy? And that's what the rest of this presentation is about. But before we get to that, we need to ask ourselves, is it even possible, given the complexity of that, to encompass all of that in a single vision? And to do that, I want to briefly look at 4 museums and 1 city that have all faced a similar sort of challenge. And we're going to look at their organizing model. The first of those is the British Museum in London. The British Museum has a geographical organizing model. Up top right there, you'll see their strapline, which is a museum of the world for the world, which tells you right there their organizing principle and their audience. And if this is a map of the museum, and you'll see that it has geographical galleries, geographically arranged galleries. So if it's from the Middle East, it goes into the purple section there, the Middle East. So their geographical organizing structure makes it very easy for them to decide, does it belong in our museum or not, and do we tell it to our audience or not? Let's contrast that to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. The Holocaust Museum has a chronological narrative. Visitors enter on ground floor, and they travel right to the top, and they arrive at about 1934. They move through the building, going down until they get to the end at about 1949, following the path of a single chronological narrative. Again, that organizing model makes decisions about their museum relatively simple, because either events happened in that period of history and therefore belong in their story, or it doesn't. And if those events happened and they have the collections, then that's obviously what they do. But if those events happen and they don't have the collections, they have to find another way to tell the story. So their chronological narrative allows them to make decisions about what they put on. The third museum we're going to look at is the Met in New York. The Met's strapline, top right there, is 5,000 years of art, which is a really simplistic statement. If it was art, and if it happened in the last 5,000 years, then this is where you put it. And it's a taxonomic system. Taxonomy is the science of categorizing. It's a filing system. Their whole museum is quite literally a filing system. Here, top left, it says modern art. If it's art and it's modern, it goes here. One of my earliest memories, long before I got involved in museums, the first time I ever went to New York, I went to the Met. And I went to a gallery which I can only describe as being busts, white, marble, because they had nothing in common with each other. They had no historical reference to each other. They had no geographical reference to each other, but they were all white marble busts. And it looked amazing. It looked absolutely incredible, and very memorable. I mean, I wasn't involved in museums at the time, but I still recall that impact. So their system works for them. Whether it works for our museum is one of the things we're going to be talking about. And the fourth model to look at is a thematic model, and this is the Science Museum in London. The Science Museum used to be taxonomic. It used to have an engines gallery, an airplanes gallery, a ships gallery, and they have progressed. They've picked this strapline, bringing science to life and life to science. So clearly what they're trying to do is make the connection between their subject, science, and the lives of their visitors, which means they've shifted to a thematic structure. And so this is just one example of one of those themes, the challenge of materials. So it isn't a materials gallery per se, where they just take lots of materials and put it on display, but it's what the challenge of materials, what is the big theme behind that, is what is the impact on people's lives. So just taking those four models for a moment, we can say they have something in common as an organizing model. They're a philosophy statement, because it's an articulation of what each of those museums is fundamentally about. They're also quite practical statements, because it allows those museums to make decisions about what collections they should collect, what knowledge they should acquire, and how that fits into their model. And finally, also as a physical statement, because it allows them to organize the visitor interaction with the museum itself. So here's a little bit of analysis on those four models. And this is very simplistic, but it's a useful way to think about it. If we imagine a sliding scale, which on the left here starts with the question of, what can we say about what we've got? So starting with their collection of objects. And on the right has, well, what do we want to say? What's the narrative? Being very simplistic about it, the taxonomic model of the Met and the geographic model of the British Museum are right up at this end of the spectrum, saying, these are our collections, we'll put them in, and we will say what our collections tell us. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the thematic model of the Science Museum and the chronological model of the Holocaust Museum, which say, these are our big stories, we'll use our collections to tell them. Now, the reality is, of course, that all of those museums exist throughout the spectrum, and I'm being very, very simplistic by putting them at the extremes like this. The Met would be horrified if I said that that's all they do. They do much more than that. But it's a useful way for us to start to think about it, to see that they have more of an emphasis at one end or another of this spectrum. And I want to refer just for a moment to a fifth museum. This is the Kelvingrove Museum and Art Gallery in Glasgow, which has been quite an influential project in recent years, because Glasgow Museum Service made a strong statement that they're going to occupy this territory, right in the middle here. They wanted to use all their collections to tell the big themes of life. And this is a photograph of a gallery called Scotland Species that is based entirely around the collections they have, but does tell some of the big stories about Scotland's natural history. So that's the four museums I wanted to look at. And I briefly want to look at Liverpool. Liverpool is a city not dissimilar in size to Auckland. It has a slightly larger catchment area, but not dissimilar in size. And this was the Liverpool Museum, a building quite austere and classical and a little bit removed from the city, not unlike our own. They also had a very eclectic collection. They had woolly mammoths, they had buttons, butterflies, giraffes, guitars, everything under the sun. And they faced exactly the same debate that we're having now of, well, how do we make a story out of this? How do we renew our galleries? And they made a decision, and if you can read it at the bottom here, they changed the name to World Museum Liverpool. And I'll read that. This is their statement. World Museum combines historic treasures from across the globe with the latest interactive technology to make an unbeatable family day out. Well, that's their audience statement of unbeatable family day out. That's their claim. But what they've done here is saying, we're going to make our museum tell the story about how Liverpool went out to the world and how the world has somehow been brought back to Liverpool. And so this museum stopped looking at the city and started looking out from the city. And that started to make sense of their collections of woolly mammoths and guitars. But they discovered in doing that something very important, which is that the story of the city itself, of Liverpool, the story of the Beatles, of football, of all of those wonderful things that come out of Liverpool, well, where does that fit in World Museum Liverpool? Because that's an internal-looking story. And what Liverpool elected to do was build a brand new museum called the Museum of Liverpool. And I'll read their statement. The museum will demonstrate Liverpool's unique contribution to the world and showcase popular culture while tackling social, historical, and contemporary issues. And this museum is currently under construction right on the waterfront of Liverpool in one of the key sites in the city. Now, we don't necessarily have that as an option to go and say, right, this museum's great, let's have another one as well. But the reason to use this as a case study is because I think we need to be having the same debate. In this museum, are we telling the story of Auckland as we look in on ourselves, or are we telling the story of how Auckland looks out to the rest of the world? And it must be possible to do both, but we need to articulate clearly what we mean by that in order to answer some of those earlier questions. So, now we're starting to think about organizing structure for our museum. And the first place to start is the wonderful 1996 Act. For those who, I'm sure everybody in this audience is familiar, but this museum is regulated by a specific Act of Parliament unique to the museum, and these are the objectives of that Act. While I've been doing these presentations, I've run a bit of a straw poll, and I hope you'll forgive me for doing the same tonight. Out of interest, who in this audience has ever read the Auckland War Memorial Museum Act of 1996? Okay, that's about 5% of the audience. Generally, it runs about 5 or 10%. It's a very short act. I really don't recommend you read it. It's not terribly interesting. But the objectives of the act are the bit that tries to make clear something about what we are. And so don't worry about reading this, because I'm going to do a little bit of analysis on this. I said at the beginning, there are some subjective parts to this. Well, this is subjective, because these are my readings of what the act says. If you want to see past that, it's on the internet. Have a look. It's on our website as well. But the Act tells us a few things about what this museum should be about. It says, the history and environment of the Auckland region, New Zealand, and the South Pacific. It says the museum as a war memorial, and it says a celebration of the rich cultural diversity of the Auckland region. It also says a few things about how we should do things. It says we should have education which involves and entertains. We should have cultural and scientific scholarship and research. We should have customer satisfaction, and my absolute favorite at the bottom, we should have maximum community benefit. And if you could just tell me what benefit, community, and maximum means, we'll get to that one, but the others are clear. So going back to that what statement, I've broken the history and environment into two statements, because they are potentially slightly different things. So the history of the Auckland region, etc., the environment of the Auckland region, museum as a war memorial, and a celebration of rich cultural diversity. Well, you can see that this bottom statement and the top one are really closely interrelated. So let's put them together for a moment and say the celebration and history of the rich cultural diversity, the environment of Auckland region, and the museum as a war memorial. While being reductive about it, it's who, where, and war. Now, it sounds like I'm being humorous and facetious about this, but the reason to be quite so reductive about it is it fits much better in diagrams. And we're about to have a look at quite a lot of diagrams that play around with these questions of who, where, and war. But when you see these words, who, where, and war, I'm trying to pull forward what the act tells us we are supposed to be about. So they aren't intentionally overly reductive. So given that, I would offer to you that I believe there are 4 potential organizing models for our museum that we should be debating. The first of those, called Model 1, is 3 parallel strands. Now, there's quite a lot of detail in this. When the discussion is finished tonight, on your way out, you'll be given a feedback form in which all of these diagrams are there for you to take away and study. So don't worry about trying to memorize everything that I'm showing you now. All of this will be on the forms. So the first of these 3 parallel strands says who, where, and war. And this is basically where we are at the moment. They all exist in the same building, but they don't necessarily interrelate to each other. There isn't a cognitive connection between any of those stories. They're all just here. We'll talk about each of these in more detail in a minute. Model 2, I call twins. Model 2 says we have a very, very unique thing in this museum called the War Memorial. It's a slightly special thing, slightly different to the rest. And also, in Aotearoa, the connection between people and place is so interlinked that it's artificial to separate them. So we should have who and where together as one story. A story of people and place as one thing, and the War Memorial and the War Museum as a slightly different thing, and both playing to their own strengths. So that's the twins model. Model 3, I call grand unifying theory. And that says, well, is there a way we can unite everything all together? The who plus the where plus the war. Just like the Met did, just like the Holocaust Museum did. And we'll look at some examples of that in a minute. And the 4th model, I call a book of 3 chapters, which might seem very similar to the first one, but it has who, where, and more existing in their own right, but the dotted circle around the outside is meant to signify that there is a cognitive link between them. There is some visitor connection between each of those stories, and that's the big difference between it and the museum as we have it now. So we'll look at these models in a bit more detail in a minute, but before we do, we need to kind of arm ourselves with a few extra tools. The first is, what is it we're actually trying to link when we're talking about these models? Well, we obviously need to start with our collection. Looking into the future, we need to think about what things we collect and what we don't. We need to think about our research projects, what knowledge we go out and collect. We need to tie in our temporary exhibitions, what we put on, what naturally will be exhibited in this museum. We need to think about our galleries, of course, the public galleries that most of us visit, but is not the only part of the museum by any means. We need to think about the image and how we portray ourselves. We need to think about the commerce, a big part, an important part of this museum, the services and products we sell, our outreach, how we engage with communities, and finally, of course, the audiences we're trying to attract. And I would offer that if we get the model right in a way that we can articulate, then answering all of these, linking them becomes a lot easier, and that's when the fog starts to disappear. So I'm going to, before we look at them in more detail, talk a little bit about audiences. Who comes, who doesn't come, and for us to think a little bit about who will come in the future. Well, there's the answer to who comes. Roughly speaking, 500,000 people a year. You will hear many apocryphal stories about this museum having 1 million people a year in the past, and huge fluctuations in visitor numbers. The reality is that in the past, ways of counting visitors has not always been reliable. Thankfully, they are now, and so we do know how many people are coming, but they haven't been reliable in the past. But looking back over the records, we can suppose that there have always been, in recent memory, roughly 500,000 people a year. So who comes? About 60% of our visitors are women, about 40% are men, which might surprise, but is actually really quite in line with most international museums are very similar to this. So who comes by origin? We have 44% are from overseas, 46% from Auckland. So virtually in perfect balance between Aucklanders and internationals. So when we're talking about what sort of model we want to create, we do need to think about how it impacts those two audiences, not forgetting our dear friends from the rest of New Zealand, the 10%. But it's really interesting to me what a perfect balance there is between these two very different markets. We look at that Auckland audience in a bit more detail. Well, where do those Aucklanders come from? This is the visitation by the areas of the city. So 33% of our visitors come from central Auckland. Fine, that doesn't tell us a great deal until we compare it with the census data. So that behind is the census data. This tells us that in proportion to the number of people out there, central Auckland, yeah, we're about in proportion, as we are for North Auckland and the North Shore, not far off for West Auckland. But those two, South Auckland and East Auckland, are really interesting. East Auckland is a tiny percentage of the city. 3% of Aucklanders live in East Auckland, but 11% of our visitors are. Likewise, more than 30% of Aucklanders live in South Auckland, but only 15% come. So we see those figures are telling us something about how this museum is serving those Auckland ratepayers who pay for it. The final bit about audiences is who comes by group. And there's the standout statistic, obviously, of that 46% of Aucklanders who come, nearly half of them come as families. And by families, we mean those with children under the age of 14. And that really are those who dominate this museum. And many of those people are very, very engaged with our museum and are probably at home looking after their children tonight. And very, surprisingly, I suspect it won't be 43% of our audience tonight will be from those groups. So now it's time to look at the models in more detail, armed with that knowledge. So looking at 3 parallel strands, as I say, this is an evolution of where we are at the moment. In this model, there isn't a cognitive link between the who, the where, and the war, other than the fact they're all in the same building. So we have to link them with something. And these red phrases were the phrases I read from the Act earlier. So these are how we go about doing business. That's how we would link it in this model. So we would service our customers equally well, we'd service our visitors equally well in all 3 parts of the museum, but they are, in essence, 3 parallel museums: a social history museum, a natural sciences museum, and a politics and identity museum. So this is a little model of what that might be like. Here's an evolution of the existing model. Its vision might be something along the lines of 3 stories over 3 stories. So we have the who, the social and cultural history, where, natural history, and war on the top. Very, very familiar to all of you, of course, because it's an evolution of where we are at the moment. Looking at model 2, which was the twins model, this is the model that recognized the war memorial as something slightly different, and that the who and the where, the people and the place, are so interlinked. I'm going to look at 2 variants of that. Model 2A is about making a city museum. So the who and the where linked at the scale of Auckland, the environment of Auckland, the volcanoes that make the city, etc., and the people of Auckland as a city museum, which would free up the war galleries to become the de facto National War Museum that it already is, in effect. The variant 2B is to say, no, the geography of Auckland isn't constrained to the city, it's in fact Pacific-wide, and the people of the city are Pacific-wide as well, both historically and today. And that says, no, we should make a Pacific museum. And that, in turn, actually frees up the Auckland region war memorial to do exactly what it does, which is memorialize those from the Auckland region. So in both cases, it allows us to make decisions appropriate to each part. So here's a little model of the first of that. So this is meant to signify a city museum of who and where, so the interlink of people and place, with a de facto National War Museum above it. And the second version of that is Pacific Stories in Science, so it's a Pacific Museum and a Auckland Region museum above it. So essentially it's presented as 2 experiences, a Pacific Museum as an exploration of place and a War Museum as an exploration of humanity, identity, and character. So, model 3, which was the grand unifying theory, and again, 2 variants of this. The first of those, if we remember back to what we said about the Met, was a taxonomy. So that's who plus where plus war. And that could be effectively like an encyclopedic museum. That model, a treasure chest of tales and tonga, or a cabinet of curiosities. Basically, a miscellany of collections celebrated for their own value. The 3B is a grand narrative, a single narrative that runs across the entire museum. And here's an example of one of those stories. It could be, for example, called Arrivals. The arrival of people, the arrival of species, and the arrival of conflict. So finally, a little look at what those models might be like. So this is seeing a treasure chest of tales and tonga as a collection-led. It would be quite an eccentric museum. This is the museum in which elephants belong right next to butterflies and belong right next to violins. Structure may be loose and flexible, allowing contemporary research or collection-led stories to fit somehow. 3B is that grand narrative, just like the Holocaust Museum. So a single narrative with 3 branches, and that would be a strongly narrative museum linking who, where, and more. And again, that example is arrivals, the arrival of people, the arrival of species, and the arrival of conflict. So the final model we're going to look at is what I call the Book of 3 Chapters. And I think of this as like a travel guide. If you travel overseas, you might go to Sydney, you might buy the Rough Guide to Sydney or the Blue Guide to Sydney. And in that, you'll find the chapters that paint a portrait of that place. So there'll be a chapter on architecture, chapter on culture, a chapter on the history. And each of those chapters builds up your picture of that place. So the way to think about these models, these 2 variants, as being a portrait of, in this case, Auckland, in this case, New Zealand. And it could be there's another model which is Pacific. But the purpose is to say that each of our 3 main stories, the who, the where, the war, would be centered around the same scale. So centered on Auckland or centered on New Zealand. And the link between them is that idea of a kind of building portrait. So as you visit more of the museum, you build more of a knowledge of the city or more of a knowledge of the country. So here is a little study of what that might be. So 4A is a guidebook to Auckland. Auckland's people, Auckland's world, Auckland in the world. Each floor playing to its strengths with a loose linkage. And 4B is a guidebook to New Zealand that says we're telling the story of New Zealand's people, New Zealand's war, New Zealand in the world, and each floor, again, playing to its own strengths. So those are the 4 models and the variants of them. And that's the meat of all of this, except that in your feedback, there might be another model, a 5th, a 6th, a 7th, however, that you want to feedback to us that you feel is more appropriate still. And the forms you'll get at the end of the evening would allow you to do so. So now we get to the real meat of it, which is, what do you think? And at this point, I hand back to Sir Don briefly. Thank you.